All right, so we're about 5 minutes past 6:30, so I think we should go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone in person and online who's joining us. I'm Brianna Walker. I am on the leadership team for Union County. Union County Wildlife Chapter. Sorry, I'm in so many different organizations. I get things confused sometimes. But thank you for joining the Union County Wildlife Chapter for our monthly meeting. Just a few things to cover. If you're in the building and you haven't been here before, some like housekeeping. If you need to use the restroom, it's down the hall. Take a right, go through the double doors, and then it's on the left. So if you need to at any time, that's where you'll find that. And then we do have a lot of upcoming and exciting programs. So March 13th is our next monthly meeting, and that will be here at the Union County Agricultural Center. That is plant pathology with Dr. Morgan Carter from UNC Charlotte. March 29th at 9 a.m., we will also be meeting here at the Agricultural Center, and we are doing a stream quality, water quality stream walk with Monroe Stormwater. And so we'll be looking for macroinvertebrates. So please come out and join us for that. We will also be at Kids in Nature Day at Squirrel Lake Park, which is hosted by the Matthews chapter, the Hawk chapter. That's April 5th, and it's open to the public, so anybody can stop by. And then on April 12th, we have a litter sweep here. It's going to be at Jesse Helms Park, so kind of right behind the Agricultural Center. So we're looking for lots of volunteers to help us with that litter sweep and give back to Earth Day. And then May 8th, we're still deciding a time. The time is still to be decided. I think it'll probably be 8 p.m. We are doing Moth Night with Lenny Lampel here at the Agricultural Center. So it has to be after dark when the moths start coming out. So that's all of the upcoming events that we have. We are an affiliate of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. So our whole goal is to educate and promote conservation and conservation education. So tonight, our program is specifically on feral hogs, and that is with Lindsay. Tell me if I mess up your last name. Lindsay Dyal. And Lindsay did her master's studying feral hogs. So I will turn it over to her to get started. And Alden, one last thing that I meant to mention, if you can just save your questions, you can pop them into the chat throughout, but we're going to wait until the end to actually answer questions. And at that point, if you want to raise your hand, we can even take you off mute and you can answer, or you can ask them, or you can just put it through in the chat throughout the talk, and we'll get to them at the end. Is there anything I forgot?
No, I think you got it so much. Thank you, Brianna.
All right. Let's. There we go.
And this is working?
Yes,
okay.
It should be working.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Lindsay Dyal, like she said, and I'm really excited to be here. I actually don't get to talk about this stuff much anymore. I'm kind of out of the wildlife biology world a little bit. I now do the regenerative farming side of things here in Unionville, so it's really nice to be able to kind of jump back into the wildlife biologist world and talk a little bit about what I did for my master's thesis at the University of Georgia. So specifically tonight, we're going to talk about the effects of environmental and demographic attributes on behavioral state resource selection and home ranges of wild pigs. So to start off with, I'll give you a little bit of background on me. I grew up here in Unionville, North Carolina, so I am local. And I went to North Carolina State University where I studied wildlife biology. And while I was there, I did a few internships with the University of Montana and the University of Wyoming. One of which was working with snowshoe hares and looking at long-term effects of different forest management systems out west. And then after that, I went back and worked with the University of Wyoming for a while on two different studies. One was a deer elk ecology research project where we looked at competition between the two species, but we also looked at mortality for mule deer fawns and elk calves. And then after that, I returned back to the southeast to the University of Georgia where I studied wild pigs. Throughout that project, we did several different things. I was part of a toxic bait ecology study. I also was part of a translocation study where we were looking at how wild pigs move after they're translocated. And then also, finally, we looked at specific movement ecology questions such as behavioral state, resource selection, as well as what the pig's home range size and shape on a weekly scale. After that, my husband and I moved up to upstate New York, where we did some different things with a high fence deer farm up there. And a lot of that, honestly, was just population management and farming. And so we really liked that lifestyle. We liked working together, and we decided we wanted to get back close to family. So we moved back home and we opened our own regenerative farm called Heaven's Dew Farm, which is in Unionville, North Carolina. So tonight, we're going to cover a few different things. The first thing I'm going to cover is I'm going to explore the correlation between wild pig behavioral states and resource selection. And then I'm going to quantify wild pig home ranges at the weekly scale and provide a better understanding of what factors influence shape and size at that same temporal scale. So we know that wild pigs are a really successful invasive species. You can see here that the black denotes their native range and the gray denotes their invasive or exotic range. And specifically in the United States, this is a map from 1982 of where wild pigs were estimated to be, and this is now 2019. So we can see that they're expanding rapidly across the U.S., and as of 2019, wild pigs were reported in 35 different states. Their population was estimated at over 6 million and growing, and range expansion was due to a variety of factors that includes adaptability to a variety of climates and conditions. So wild pigs are generalists. They generally don't have a lot that holds them back from moving into any kind of different climate. They also lack natural predators. Like most invasive species, there's not really anything in the food web that kind of keeps wild pigs in check in most areas. And then also a big one is translocations by humans. And I say it quite a bit after studying wild pigs that wild pigs are a bit of a paradox, and that's one reason we see a lot of expansion is wild pigs are a sport animal, but people like to hunt them, but also wild pigs do a lot of damage and have negative impacts across the landscape. But we do see some people really enjoy them, so we see wild pigs moved across the landscape for that purpose. So with wild pigs having such a large population presence, they also have a lot of negative impacts. For one, they degrade environmental areas such as streams, as well as a lot of ag. They degrade a lot of crops. They also depredate and compete with native species, and they transmit diseases to domestic livestock, native wildlife species, and there are zoonotic diseases that can also spread to people. So we see that that's a serious issue for wildlife managers as well as agricultural producers. And right now, it's estimated that wild pigs cause about $1.5 billion worth of damage to ag, natural resources, and personal property. So quite a large number. And currently, there's not a lot of management strategies that we can employ, especially at a population scale, that are really sufficient for controlling population expansion. So just a little more background. There's a lot of research done on other ungulates like deer and other animals, but wild pigs, they're not completely studied as far as movement ecology. A lot of people know they're a generalist species. They like to be everywhere, and that's it. However, there's a lot more to it, and if we get more down to a fine scale, we're a lot more successful in our management practices. So until this study, behavioral states had not been directly linked for wild pigs, that is, to resource selection in terms of movement. And habitat characteristics that meet these different needs of wild pigs, specifically these required resources such as food, water, cover, the same thing that is required for people, that's generally spatially segregated on the landscape. So you don't necessarily have that accessible in the same area. And so these animals are going to be driven by the fact that they're moving across the landscape in search of these required resources. And so innovative management is critical given that we see a rapid increase in their population expansion across their exotic or introduced range. So broad scale influencers, I keep talking about fine scale influencers, but they're very much the same as far as what's spatially driving them. It's more of a temporal scale that we want to get at as far as fine scale predictors. So these broad scale influencers that we use quite often to look at or to design our management plans and model population persistence and expansion are these distribution of these required resources. So food, water, and cover, and where they are on the landscape, as well as population density. And this could be wild pigs or any other animal that they are competing with. So not just interspecific competition, but also intraspecific competition as well. And then we'll also look at meteorological conditions, because this also drives most animal movement, where they might be restricting their movement during certain types of weather patterns and maybe moving more during others. Specifically for wild pigs, they are limited thermoregulatory capabilities, and so they don't thermoregulate well. They don't cool down very well. They don't heat up very well, and so they utilize stuff on the landscape to help with that. So our study was done at the Savannah River site, and the Savannah River site is a privately owned area, kind of like a military base, that's owned by the Department of Energy. So it's a private area that people can't just come in and go out, but also it's fenced, so the pigs that we collared also couldn't move in and out of that area. So it was a nice controlled place for us to do a study like this. And it's primarily forested. It has less than 5% development. It's got 50% upland pines, typical, South Carolina, Georgia type habitat, 25% bottomland hardwoods, 8% upland hardwoods. So those areas that aren't necessarily defined as much by your riparian areas. And then 10% shrub and herbaceous areas. And what we classified shrub and herbaceous is a lot more of your primary and secondary succession type habitat. So not, full grown habitats and stuff that might be described as thicker type cover. And specifically, this was kind of overgrown on areas that were old power lines or old logging roads and places like that. Also, it has an extensive stream network on the Savannah River site. So as we think about all that I just said, as far as wild pigs moving across the landscape and potentially, or specifically, what a behavioral state actually is, when I talk about defining behavioral states and how that influences resource selection, when I talk about a behavioral state, what I'm talking about is just a response to the environment as they move across a heterogeneous landscape and interact with certain things. And specifically, what we're looking at is when they get to a certain area, say with that dense cover, like a shrub and herbaceous area, what do they do in that type habitat? Are they bedding in that? Are they foraging in that? Are they using that for some other purpose? And can we tease that out of some fine-scaled temporal data? That way we know kind of where and how to target management strategies across the landscape. So like I said, usually, certainly in high quality habitat, we have a lot of these required resources that are very close together, and therefore you don't see as much movement. However, usually you see a lot of these resources distributed across the landscape that aren't super close. Just like, I like to think about it just like myself, as if my kitchen is, one place in the house and I travel there to get food, and then another place, I might go to my bed to take a nap, or vice versa. Pigs are the exact same way. They're not going to necessarily bed in the same place they're foraging or where they're traveling to get other resources. And these resources change in availability throughout the year. And it's not necessarily based on the way we look at seasons. So it's not necessarily spring or summer, fall, winter, but just like the farming side of me now, we have seasonal things that are available, and pigs don't have the ability to go to the grocery store and get whatever they want. So these resources are changing across the landscape as the seasons change. And so we see food changing, resources changing like that, cover, especially with deciduous habitat types, and ephemeral streams. We have streams that dry up and are here sometimes and not others. And so with that, we wanted to not only tease out the behaviors and how they influence resource selection, but we also wanted to tease that out across the year by season so that we could get even more fine scale. So with that, the way we defined our seasons was we defined a time period of resource abundance in the Southeast, and then a time period of resource or scarcity. And so we had some unpublished diet data that we had access to for wild pigs at the Savannah River site. And so we were able to use that, as well as some of the movement stuff we had to identify these seasons. And one was called the low forage season. This was the time of resource scarcity. And so that was from January through April. And wild pigs typically focused on subterranean foods during this time period. So they ate mainly roots and tubers and earthworms. During the high forage season, this is a time of resource abundance, especially in the southeast. Excuse me. So this was delineated between May and December, and this is a time period in the southeast where we have a lot of hard mass, a lot of soft mass, such as blackberries and blueberries and plums. And then also I have a red star. This is actually a picture of our farm, but I have a red star on this because this was not a factor at the Savannah River site, but it certainly correlates with the same time period in the southeast of ag and a lot of crops on the landscape during this time period, where wild pigs are certainly keying in on that, and that's dictating movements off in a lot of places in the southeast, just not within our study. So how do we collect the data for the pigs? We used corral traps with Jaeger Pro drop gates. So we had cameras that would send us text messages after we had studied the sounders, and we would drop the gates and catch whole sounders of pigs. And then we would go in and we would anesthetize the animals. We would put GPS collars on them, and then we would reverse the anesthesia and release them back at the trap site with GPS collars that collected GPS locations every hour. So over that time period, we had individuals from 2014 all the way through 2019. I was there for a period of that time, and during that time, we trapped well over 100 pigs. But pigs don't have much of a neck, and with GPS collars, they tend to slip these collars sometimes. These collars might malfunction, or we might have certain pigs that we have a period worth of data, but we don't really stretch across those seasons. So we chose to use some of those, and others we chose not to. So during the low forage season, we had 37 total individuals. 21 were females and 16 were males. And then we had 41 in the high forage season. 20 of these were females and 21 were males. And like I said, once again, we had these GPS collars set to take GPS locations every 1 hour. And that's certainly a trade-off. We could say we could get more fine scale, maybe with 30-minute data. But the 1 hour interval, we felt as though we could get fine enough scale data to answer our questions. And also this makes these collars last longer, because the more GPS locations they're taking, the faster that battery will die. So how do we identify these behaviors? We use what's called hidden Markov models. And hidden Markov models are just a fancy name for a two-process model. So the first process is an observation or a parameter process. And so this is just where you feed the model information. And the information we fed it was step lengths, or the distance in between consecutive GPS locations for an individual, and then turning angles, which is also just the angle between those consecutive GPS locations for each individual. And then the second process of this model is it's then going to take those parameters and spit out at what they call a hidden state. And so we're describing that as the behavioral states. So to make sure we didn't overfit any of our data, we did both a 2 and a 3 state hidden Markov model for both males and females in both seasons. So we could separate everything out and make sure we identified different activity patterns for males and females in each season. So then we pulled out habitat covariates that we wanted to test for, that we were saying, hey, this is what they're selecting for, or this is what they're avoiding. So what we did was we used distance to these certain habitat types because of the way you create these layers. If I would have said just overall bottomland hardwoods or upland hardwoods, and there is a pixel that represents that, and we had animals right on the outside every once in a while, then it would consider that avoidance rather than, hey, they are close to this habitat type, and they're close to it more than they're far away from it. So they're close to or within it. And so we had distance to bottomland hardwoods, upland pines, shrub and herbaceous, streams, roads, and then we also looked at percent canopy cover. And so I've been talking a lot about fine scale data, but just so we had a direct comparison within our data, rather than comparing our data to just other wild pigs across the US or other studies, we wanted to look at broad scale and fine scale so we had direct comparison. So we looked at where these wild pigs are placing their home ranges on the landscape, which is called second order resource selection. So overall, they have a certain amount available, and then after that, we're looking at where they actually chose to place their home range. And so how we did that was within our study area, we generated what we called our available study area. So an area around where we trapped most of our individuals. And then we buffered that to make sure that there weren't any long distance traveling type movements outside of that area. We then systematically sampled within that available area and called those available locations for these wild pigs to place their home ranges. And we then directly compared that to generated home ranges from our GPS locations for all our wild pigs. And we systematically sampled within that and called that used locations. So we directly compared the used locations within the home range to what was available to them in our study area. Then we got into a little bit more fine scale stuff, which is the behavioral state resource selection. So the way we did that, we looked at these generated home ranges, and we now systematically sampled these generated home ranges and said that is now what's available to these animals to act out each one of these behaviors. And then we used the actual GPS locations from their collars and directly compared that to the systematically sampled locations within their home ranges to see how they were utilizing the area actually within their home ranges specifically for each one of these behaviors. So our results for that, we ended up fitting a 3-state hidden Markov model as our top model for both seasons and sexes. And what those behavioral states ended up looking like as we teased them out was what we described as a resting state. So this is where they're bedding. We have short step lengths and tight turn angles during that, that specific behavioral state. And when I say tight turn angles, these collars are going to have a little bit of air, just like when you do Find My iPhone or something like that, and you're looking and it, it might ping all around and your iPhone's in the middle of that. Same with these collars. We have a little bit of air, and so what that looks like as far as turning angle is super tight turning angles if they're staying in the same location over and over and over for a period of time. We then had a foraging state. So this is very similar to resting, except for we had a little bit more of linear movements between the consecutive points. So we had short to medium step lengths, but still those tight turning angles. So if you think about how wild pigs forage, you would think about them rooting around in a certain area and not necessarily going somewhere linearly, but continuing to circle around in that area and focus on that resource. And then we had a traveling state. So this was longer step lengths representing more linear movements with much more shallow turn angles. And this is the data for that for both seasons, the low forage and the high forage seasons for males and females. And so you can just see that the resting state had much shorter step lengths and turn angles. And then there's the foraging state and the traveling state. We obviously see we have a lot longer distances and shallower turn angles. So this is the results of activity patterns. And so the dark gray bars represent nighttime hours and the light gray bars represent daytime hours. We have females on the left-hand side and males on the right-hand side. And then we have a low forage season on the top and high forage season on the bottom. What we can take away from this is, one, males and females it's good to look at their activity patterns separate because we definitely see different patterns for them. Males are pretty much consistently nocturnal during both seasons here. We can see a peak in the traveling during those nighttime hours and a peak in resting during the daytime hours. And, foraging is teased out in there with a peak during those nighttime hours as well. Whereas females, I would describe their behavior in high forage season much more crepuscular, where we see a peak in traveling around dawn and dusk as well as foraging, but we see a peak in the resting during the rest of the time. And the low forage season, they have a very unique kind of movement pattern where they are moving much more at dawn, at dusk. And this is probably the difference between males and females, as well as the difference between the low and the high forage season for females is probably directly linked to reproductive responsibilities. So female wild pigs are going to move differently when they have certain aged piglets or shotes in tow with them. And so that's probably what we're seeing here. So now the second order resource selection was where are these animals placing their home ranges on the landscape. And so what we're looking here is the predictive odds for both the low and the high forage season. That dotted line in the center there at 1 is going to be kind of what we're looking on either side of. And so on the left-hand side of that is going to be selection, and on the right-hand side of that is going to be avoidance. And we have females represented with blue and males represented with orange. And the only one that is going to be inverse of all that is percent canopy cover. The way it's calculated, it's actually going to be selection on the right-hand side the dotted line, and avoidance on the left-hand side of the line. If anything overlaps that dotted line, it means it's not significant in basically dictating where they've placed their home range. So I'm just going to highlight a few of these that are important. So distance to streams, we see there is a selection for areas close to streams for home range placement for both males and females in both the high and the low forage season. And then this distance to secondary road, we see that they are avoiding secondary roads for home range placement in the low forage season. And in the high forage season, females are still avoiding secondary roads for home range placement, but it becomes insignificant for males. And then we'll move to third order resource selection. So we have this, this right now is just the low forage season. We have all 3 states on the right as far as resting, foraging, and traveling. And then same thing with the dotted line in the middle and 95% confidence intervals. So what we're highlighting here is distance to stream. Females are actually avoiding areas that are close to streams within their home range, which is inverse of placement of their home range during the resting behavioral state, but it's insignificant for the other 2 behavioral states. And then males during the low forage season are actually selecting still for areas close to these streams for the resting state, but it's insignificant for the other 2 states. And then this shrub and herbaceous, or this kind of primary, secondary succession type habitat, females are selecting for this for resting, but they're actually avoiding this while traveling, and it's insignificant for foraging, while males, on the other hand, are selecting for this in every behavioral state. And then secondary roads, we see that females are avoiding this during both resting and foraging, while males are actually avoiding this during resting, but actually selecting to utilize these areas close or on secondary roads for traveling purposes. And then I have these highlighted in red here because these have strong selection patterns for both sexes across the low forage season for every behavioral state. So we can see that males and females selected for areas close to or within bottomland hardwoods during every behavioral state, and they also selected for areas with high percentages of canopy cover. So just to tease out a little bit more here, we can see that females in the resting state had a 10% decrease in use for every 100 meters farther away from shrub and herbaceous vegetation. And also females in the foraging state had a 32% decrease in use for every 100 meters farther away from bottomland hardwood. So now the high forage season. We see that females were selecting for, now we see that they're selecting for this area close to or within upland hardwoods during the high forage season during every behavioral state, while males, on the other hand, are selecting for this while resting, but avoiding this when foraging, and it's insignificant for them when they're traveling. Once again, distance to streams, females are avoiding areas close to streams within their home range during every behavioral state. As well, males are also avoiding this now when traveling and foraging, and it becomes insignificant for resting. Distances close to secondary roads were avoided by females for every behavioral state, while males, once again, have a very strong selection for this while traveling, but they're obviously avoiding this for both resting and foraging. And I've got these highlighted in red again because across both of these seasons and behavioral states for both sexes, we see another strong selection for areas close to or within bottomland hardwoods and high percentages of canopy cover. So to recap, we saw similarities and differences in selection and activity patterns between sexes across seasons and across spatial scales. And what those were the activity patterns. We saw that females had more of a crepuscular pattern, whereas males had more of a nocturnal pattern. We also saw a difference in use from upland hardwoods by females. Females were selecting for this in every behavioral state during the high forage season, whereas males were not utilizing this for every behavioral state. And then secondary roads, we saw males were utilizing these secondary roads for probably some of these mating linear movements and traveling, while females were usually avoiding this in every behavioral state. And then across seasons, we saw that upland hardwoods were used differently by females across seasons, and males specifically were selecting for more diversity during that low forage season than during that high forage season. And then lastly, across spatial scales, which is what I was talking about with the second order resource selection. So where are they placing their home ranges versus what are they actually using within that home range? We saw that they pretty much females and males placed home ranges very close to streams, but in their home range, they were actually avoiding areas that were right on, like near or on top of streams for each specific behavior. So what can we take away from that? We know that wild pigs are generalists, and usually that's kind of what it's chalked up as, is they'll be anywhere and do anything, and you can be successful in anything you do when you go out to trap or hunt these animals. But they do have fine scale movement patterns that really, if we pick up on that, it can make management a lot more efficient and effective. And some of that, just to say it and reiterate it, is, females selected for shrub and herbaceous habitat while resting only. And males selected once again for those secondary roads while traveling only. And so not identifying these behaviors and separating them specifically from by sex as well as season can wash out a lot of that data, and it can make it where it's much more difficult to target these animals. So our next objective is quantifying wild pig home range size and shape at a weekly scale, so a fine temporal scale once again. And we're going to look at those based on vegetative composition, meteorological conditions, landscape characteristics such as roads, and then individual level attributes. So once again, the data collection was very similar. A lot of the data we used was the same, but we had 49 total collared wild pigs for this study, same collection process, 27 females and 22 males. And throughout that, we used 7-day periods to have a week, and we were able to quantify 157 unique weekly periods across our study time. And each one of those unique weekly periods had a sample size ranging between 4 and 22 males and 4 and 18 females. So our statistical analysis, what we did was we used home range estimators. We used a kernel density estimator for our home range size. And for our home range shape, we actually used a different home range estimator, mainly because the way those kernel densities work, sometimes they have multiple polygons around different high use areas of GPS locations for each individual. So that's really hard to quantify, multiple polygon shape. And so we used minimum convex polygons to look at our shape, and we used the shape index that looked at perimeter versus area. And then we quantified some different covariates for looking at what kind of dictated home range shape and size. And we looked at sex. This time we looked at proportion of upland pines and bottomland hardwoods, our two dominant habitat types within our study area. We still looked at distance to streams, and then our meteorological conditions we looked at was average weekly maximum temperature, precipitation, and atmospheric pressure. So we made sure none of our covariates were correlated, and what that means is specifically like our proportion of upland pines and bottomland hardwoods, those are inversely correlated. So when one goes up, the other one goes down. And so we don't want to test those in the same model because it's kind of asking the same question within the same model. So what we do is we just test those separately in different models. And so we generated several different models for home range size and as well as home range shape. And then we used a model selection criteria to pick our top ranking models for each of those. So our results for that. Females had an average weekly home range size of 4.75 square kilometers, and males had a much larger home range of 13.81 square kilometers. And then and you can see on the right-hand side here, that is the kernel density. So you can see some of these have multiple polygons for one individual. And then we use these minimum convex polygons for our shape, our home range shape. And so we saw a range from 1.03, which was our most circular home range, to 1.84, which was our most elongate home range. And we had a median of 1.13, indicating that more of our individuals had circular home ranges compared to a semi-elongate home range. Okay, so our results for home range size, our models, our top model included an interaction between sex and proportion of bottomland hardwoods within the home ranges. And what that means is they were just dependent upon one another. These covariates were dependent on each other. And we see that it's a negative correlation. So when a proportion of upland or bottomland hardwoods increased, we actually saw home range size decrease, which makes sense because this is a high quality habitat for wild pigs. So those required resources are going to be a lot closer together. And since this is an interaction, we can actually see that females are a little bit more tied to this resource than males. The slope of that line is a little bit different than the males. We also had average atmospheric pressure that dictated home range size at the weekly scale. And this is a positive correlation. So as atmospheric pressure increased, we actually saw home range size increase on a weekly scale as well. And then we had a negative correlation with average maximum temperature. So as average maximum temperature increased throughout the week, we actually saw home range size decrease. And while average precipitation was a predictor in our top model, it was not a significant predictor. So the results of our home range shape, we also once again had an interaction, and this interaction was average distance to stream and proportion of upland pines. So once again, this just means that they're tied together. And so the black line, the solid black line, represents areas close to streams. And what we saw as we increased the proportion of upland pines and at areas close to streams, we actually saw those areas were more circular, while as we decreased the proportion of upland pines at close distances to streams, we saw those became more elongate home ranges. And at far distance to streams, it became insignificant. So what does this mean? Habitat quality, high quality habitat facilitates reduced movement. So like we were talking about, these required resources such as food, water, and cover are generally going to be in areas closer to each other in these high quality habitats, which in our case was bottomland hardwoods. These are generally riparian areas that have an abundance of, oaks. So they have a lot of acorns, they have a lot of vaccinium and other plants like that, as well as plenty of water, and they're deciduous areas with high amounts of cover. Also, we saw that temperature and pressure are key meteorological factors that impact movement. Like I said at the beginning of this presentation, wild pigs have limited thermoregulatory capabilities, so they can't really control their body temperature really well. And so when we have increased temperature, a lot of times we see these animals restrict areas to reliable cover to be able to keep cool and maintain a consistent body temperature. And for pressure, high pressure is generally associated with fair, nice, pretty days where, we all want to be out and moving a little bit more. And so do wild pigs. So during that kind of pressure system, we see larger home range sizes. And during low pressure systems where we have more stormy weather, rainy events, we see them actually decrease their home range size at a weekly scale, probably once again for reliable cover. Also, we see that streams and surrounding habitat can drive shape of home ranges. And that's best shown on something like this, where we can see that once again, those covariates that I was describing, upland pines and bottomland hardwoods, are negatively correlated. So when you have an increase in one, you're going to have a decrease in the other. And so what we were seeing was we saw more semi-elongate home ranges with less upland pines within those home ranges. And what that means is probably they're restricted to these riparian corridors, and streams are actually providing barriers to these home ranges. And so you see more elongate home ranges along these streams, while as they move out more into the upland pine habitat, they acquire more of a circular home range, most likely because they're still moving into that higher quality habitat to acquire some of these resources. However, they're moving out and searching around in these upland pines as well. So now we'll wrap up with some conclusions and management implications. So management implications of our study overall was understanding the relationship between resources and behavior, especially at a fine scale, can make management more efficient and effective, and it can also allow us to design some new strategies to target wild pigs. And also it can improve the quality of management decisions. So for one, we can tease out the difference in activity patterns for males and females, and we know that females are a large part of our reproduction on the landscape. And so if we're targeting for population control, we want to target those females. And so we want to target based on their activity pattern, as well as where these animals are utilizing certain resources especially if we also have the research to know when these animals are reproducing throughout the year and target them based on that. Also, we can provide insight into disease transmission, like I said, especially for farms or farmers, as well as just in general high densities of people. When these animals move into these areas, they generally carry diseases that are not necessarily well known to a lot of people, and they can infect a lot of different animals and people. So it's really important for us to know where these individuals are, especially high densities of them, so we can be kind of on the brink of making sure that there's not a large amount of disease transmission. Also, it allows us to make informed and adaptive small-scale management decisions on that week-by-week basis. I like to say, management doesn't happen annually. We might have an annual review or something, but managements happen day by day, week by week. And so if we can adjust management just as these pigs are adjusting to what they're feeling or experiencing on the landscape on a week-by-week basis, then we are more likely to be successful in controlling their populations. We can also use landscape barriers such as streams that we see these individuals place home ranges near. They're very important for these animals, and we can see that they act as barriers for these animals. So we can utilize that in specific strategies such as trapping, as well as toxic bait and other options that we might have as management strategies. We can place these along these areas, especially areas where we think we might interact with the most number of animals. Also, densely targeting high quality habitat goes back to the same thing of targeting high densities of these animals. And then also interpreting meteorological conditions in the short term can help us not only reduce costs, so we're not wasting time and money out there during times that these animals might be restricting movement and really not in an easy state to be able to be interacted with or trapped or however we're trying to manage. And it can also increase our success of interaction with each of these animals. So with that, I would like to acknowledge just our funding source for that project, as well as all the colleagues and technicians that made it possible for us to trap and analyze the data from all these wild pigs. So with that, I will take questions.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to say real quick before we do take questions, and this is for the people online too, I was going to let Andy Cranfield speak for just a second. He works in our soil and water department here in Union County, and we have been working on a project to help track feral hogs. So I was just going to let him tell you a little bit about what's being done, and so maybe that might answer some questions too.
Stand in front of the camera. Oh, they want to stare at me. Hello, everybody. I'm Andy Cranfield. I'm the Natural Resource Conservationist for Soil and Water here in Union County. Started back in May of last year with Soil and Water, but I've been in the natural resource field for about 29 years now in Union County. I work for the North Carolina Forest Service. And as part of that, I've been able to see with the feral swine, the movement. Because I've worked in the forest, I've been all over the county. So we've noticed over time, in Union County, the spread from kind of that southeast corner of Union County, and it's kind of moving up towards Monroe. So knowing this, we've been talking to farmers and kind of doing some research, and with the studies going on, we're starting to see the effects that feral swine have on the wildlife and wildlife habitat. We're seeing the concerns over the spread of disease. And when you start really looking into feral swine and see what the diseases they can carry, it's kind of awakening. But probably the biggest thing for us, Union County is a large agricultural community. And a lot of the farmers are starting to talk about all the damage that they're seeing from feral swine. So that's a problem because that's money lost and that's income loss. So we wanted to do something. So through a grant, Union County Soil and Water was able to purchase a Jaeger Pro swine trap. They purchased it back in spring, right before I started. So with that, we were trying to come up with a program. We got to come up with some kind of program that we can do to maybe help with this problem. about the time we've got the trap and kind of trying to get everything started, lo and behold, the Department of Agriculture Veterinary Division, they purchased several traps. So we were able to partner with the Veterinary Division and kind of come up with a program. We had I guess you call it a roundtable event back in the fall of last year, and some of our state, federal, and local partners and private partners got together and kind of just discussing the problem. Catawba College was there. They have a big feral swine trapping program, and kind of come up with an idea of what we can do. So what we want to do is get it out there. So I don't know if you know much about these Jaeger Pro traps, and some of the data we saw here, pigs like to eat at night. So when you start a trapping program, these traps are nice. Technology is great. I can look on my phone and see them on my phone. I get pictures, notifications when something's in the trap. When I see something that I want to catch, I can push a button on my phone and catch it. Problem is they like to eat at night. The other problem is when you put corn or bait out on the site, everything wants to eat it. So me as one person, Union County Soil and Water is 3 of us. The small group we are, if you have to stay up every night or every time your phone vibrates, you have to look at it, you don't get a lot of sleep. So we quickly figured out that we need to broaden our group or our partners. So what we're doing is we have the traps in the county, but we want to develop a partnership with folks. So if you're a farmer, if you're somebody that leases land from a farmer and you have a feral swine problem, what you can do is contact Union County Soil and Water. We have forms you fill out, but basically there's a process. But we go through this process and we can loan you a trap to use on your property to catch swine. So it's kind of in the pilot program right now. We've got 2 traps in the county now, or actually right across the line in Anson County, but they're both in the field right now. One's kind of being my 2 different landowners that we're working with. So, it's a good program to kind of get it out there. It kind of spreads the burden a little bit, I guess you say, because I can't do it by myself. Department of Ag, they don't have enough folks to do it on their own. But if we can partner with you, the landowner, or you, the individual that's working on the property, or just folks that we have folks that's what they like to do. They like to go out and trap hogs. So if we can partner with you and we can get these traps out there, maybe we can slow down the spread. Because when like I said, when you start looking into what the problems these things can cause, it's pretty serious. And it's only going to get worse. These things are amazing. I've learned a lot about them. They're smart. They learn. It's amazing how quick they can figure out what a swine trap looks like and not to go into it. So there's a process. We can mess it up in a hurry if we're not careful. So I figured it'd be a good night, since we're talking about feral swine, to just come up and kind of mention what we're doing. Union County, I work for the county here. We have our program, but there's programs throughout the state. So if you're in Anson or surrounding counties and somebody that has an issue, and kind of what we want to do is just get the word out, because it's hard to kind of tell everybody. But if you may not have property, you may not have an issue, but maybe somebody that does. Just kind of tell folks about it, and maybe we can spread the word and kind of get these traps in the woods and kind of start heading off the problem before it gets any worse. But if you got any question or anything, you can contact Union County Soil and Water. We're right here at the Ag Center. We're glad to talk to you about it. Any questions, I guess?
You guys can ask questions. I'm going to read the ones off of there. So you partly answered my question, because when I was growing up, I thought that wild pigs were just part of wildlife. I didn't realize they were invasive or non-native until I was an adult. And then I still never really understood, what is their status? Are they a nuisance, invasive, need to be completely eliminated, or are they considered a naturalized wildlife, or what is their, are we trying to completely eliminate like we would? Chances are,
this is just me speaking from my perspective. I don't know that you'll ever just get rid of them. Christy Shoup is the Department of Agriculture. She's a veterinarian, so she might throw some information out there. I don't know that we'll ever completely eradicate them, but maybe hold them in check or reduce populations, I guess.
But veterinary divisions would like to get rid of them. Yes, because the significant disease risk,
specifically brucellosis. You got pseudorabies that they potentially carry, tuberculosis, and so for the department ag, we are considered a TB and a brucellosis-free state, which means we can move animals. This has been that way for a long time, and then we work really hard to make sure our domestic animals don't have those diseases. Brucellosis being spread through milk, and so we don't want to see this type of a species then passing that back to our commercial swine or our cattle. So that's one of the biggest concerns for us. And there is a national task force who's probably a part of that.
Yeah.
As this,
Yeah, and to touch on that, you were talking about the state, they are an invasive species, so they're not considered naturalized or anything to this area, and so therefore they're not protected under the North American model, which is what allows part of the issue of people translocating these individuals, selling hunts. People can now charge you to go hunt a wild pig, whereas legally you cannot do that for a native species.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you catch them in a trap, they are eliminated.
They
They're
have
not relocated. There's nothing.
Yeah, legally, you're not supposed to move them off site. So.
North Carolina law says that they must be killed in the trap.
Okay.
And they just upped the fines for that, actually.
You mean a fine for what? Not
If you are caught moving them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's become now, it used to be a civil penalty, now it's become actually a criminal penalty. Up to don't quote me 100%, like $5,000.
$5,000.
Yeah. Problem is, it's hard to catch. Folks doing it.
So one question, and I think you guys kind of touched on this a little bit, but is there an open season on the feral swine? Do you want to talk a little bit about the issues with actually shooting them?
Well, there's technically not a season on them. You do have to have a permit. You have to go online through the Wildlife Commission, and you can just apply for a permit. There's no cost for it. Basically, you just put in general information and tell them what county you're going to be trapping in. But as far as the season, it's open season year round.
So how do you
But
tell
it
the
is-
difference? I'm sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
Well, I was just gonna say, but you do want to trap them, not just go shoot them, because
I think from what I've been just through studies and all, shooting pigs is not a good idea. Several states, we talked about this earlier, have kind of outlawed hunting a pig with a firearm, because what you end up doing is breaking up the sounders and taking one group and making two groups out of it if you're not careful. So I think they're saying that hunting them not a good idea. It's better to track and try to track the whole group when you do track.
So what is the difference appearance-wise between if I just see a pig, how do I know whether it's some farmer's pig that got loose versus a wild pig?
That's actually a really good question. Well, most of the farmers' pigs you're going to see are, some of these more regenerative farms do have some individuals that are colored up differently, but they're not going to be, your pink little pig that you're going to see at a farm. A lot of these individuals some of them are ones that have escaped, and a lot of times they can change color morphs out there, but they're a combination of wild boar and feral pig. So a lot of times.
Can you please repeat the question and the answer? People online can't hear
okay.
the question and the answer.
So what was the question again?
If you see a pig, how do you know whether it's a livestock that maybe has gotten loose because a storm knocked the tree down, or whether it is a wild pig that needs to be reported, caught, eliminated, whatever?
Okay, so if you couldn't hear, if you see a pig, how do you know if it is a livestock pig, like a pig that has just gotten loose recently, or if it is a feral swine?
Yeah, and so to reiterate the answer of that is there's different color morphs, but a lot of these wild pigs are going to be, they're going to have some features of wild boar, but some of them might just have feral swine. So sometimes it can get confusing, but as the way I view it, and you guys might completely view it differently, but if there's a wild pig or any kind of wild pig out there that's loose, it's then considered a feral pig if it can't be recaught and nobody's looking for that animal. And so in my opinion, those animals are going to turn into wild pigs no matter what, whether they were from a farm or not. And so they're considered they're feral pigs, and they should be extirpated. So.
Okay. There were a few other questions online. What areas in North Carolina are the hog most dense? And is there data on injuries to humans, i.e. hikers, or any fatalities?
I feel like maybe you would be better to answer that.
So, so the Department of Ag, when we were looking at grants for feral swine trapping, we looked at several different counties. One was number one, we wanted to protect the commercial hog industry. So Sampson County is down east where we have all those hogs. We want to keep the feral swine out of there. So there was a grant that was partnered with USDA Wildlife Services where we were trapping specifically there. And then there were 5 counties that were looked at. And that was Anson, Montgomery, Davie, and Haywood counties in the mountains as well. So those were sort of the 5 counties that were targeted. But I believe, as far as North Carolina is concerned, 75 to 80 out of 100 counties have them, at least. So with more counties, certain counties are more pervasive than others.
So if you couldn't hear, 70 to 80 counties in North Carolina do have feral swine. I don't know that there's any data that shows that they have injured anyone, but as a personal anecdote, I used to work in South Georgia, and feral swine were very prevalent there. And every year at the state park where I worked, we had a canyon crash 5K. And the logo on the t-shirt was a little stick person that was being chased by a pig, because the very first year that we ever had that, someone actually was chased up a tree by a feral hog. So they will chase hikers and runners, and are dangerous to people. And we did have parks that would carry guns with them when we led hikes, especially along backcountry trails like our 7-mile trail. And we had students with us because it could be dangerous. So even though there may not be data, yes, they can happen. Let's see if there are any other questions. Can they be domesticated when young? I think maybe we kind of.
That goes back to you can't move them outside.
Yeah. I think they're not legal.
Yeah, so it's not legal to move even if the babies are trapped. You still have to dispatch or eliminate the babies, so you can't take them.
If it's on your property and you catch the babies, in theory, you're not moving them off property.
I guess if you left them.
Devil's advocate.
I don't think you can take them out of the trap at all.
Okay.
Always trying to get around the system.
Yeah, that's a loophole.
Well, you know what? Where there's a will, there's generally a way. I don't plan on catching them either.
And then I'll just put in here, they also cause vehicle collisions and can be risky to the public in suburban areas, especially when they become less afraid of people. And so another, just like, if you haven't seen them in real life, they are huge. They can get huge. And I remember that we did have one person who was from Atlanta who came to the park, and they saw a dead hog on the side of the road. And I remember an argument back and forth because she swore there was a dead bear, and it wasn't a bear. It was a feral hog. Like, they don't get as big as a bear, but they get large enough that they can be confused if they're deceased. So, and then someone did ask about if there are any guided hunts that are offered. I don't know if you guys know anything about that.
I'm sure there are. I don't know if that's necessarily, it's something that we would promote, just because that's, once again, promoting, like, somebody's probably, if they have animals on that site, then that's totally fine. If, they can do that, they can. And there's a lot of people, not just in North Carolina, that will guide wild pig hunts. But once again, it's not necessarily the best thing for management purposes.
All right. Were there any other questions, in person or online?
I was actually curious about what their competitors were. I know they don't have predator. I mean, they're not really prey for much of anything, but what's competing with the food source?
Yeah, well, wild pigs eat pretty much anything. So deer will compete, but not necessarily on the complete scale that wild pigs eat. But deer are generalists as well, and pretty much anything, even if you have like a specialist species, they could be in direct competition with wild pigs because wild pigs are going to eat pretty much anything, and they're probably going to outcompete a lot of the specialists that are native to the area.
So if you couldn't hear online, the question was, what is competing with the wild or feral hogs? So yeah, they will compete with quail. They'll compete with turkeys.
Deer.
Um,
A lot of native species, with wild pigs being generalists and them kind of using the whole landscape. They compete with farmers, so they use a lot of crops and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think one of the most upsetting things I learned is that they will actually eat the baby deer that are left. Like when the mom leaves the babies in the field and goes off and will come back to them, feral swine have been known to actually eat the baby deer. It's just so sad.
They don't discriminate.
Any other questions? I don't think we have any more online. Well, all right. Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you so much. It looks like we're good online. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who's online. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Have a great night.
Thanks, Alden.